Good morning, everyone. This is day two of the Solar Gateway, the annual gateway for MnSEIA. And the panel discussion today is essentially focusing on storage, energy storage, and how to start the storage boom in Minnesota. My name is Rao Konidana. I'm the moderator. I have some experience in storage, having worked at MISO, the grid operator, for 15 years in resource adequacy planning, economic planning, and such. I have with me a very distinguished panel who are going to basically come from this question, how to start the storage boom in Minnesota from their perspective, from their experience. And so I'm going to jump into it pretty quickly. So when I start off with a Q&A, essentially I'll let them introduce themselves, the perspective that they are bringing, and then also, have them answer these questions, because I have a couple of questions that I just want to ask to get a good initial discussion going, and we will monitor the chat box for your Q&A as we get into this. So Jason, I'll start with you in your role with the policy position that you are in at Energy Storage Association. Obviously, there's a lot going on across the industry in the grid operator environment, and Minnesota is in MISO grid operator footprint. So what can MISO learn from other ISOs on storage efforts to make this storage boom happen in Minnesota and other MISO states?
Sure, and just quickly, thanks for having me, Rao, and for the MnSEIA team, everyone tuning in. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I am tuning in from the East Coast. We are the National Trade Association. If you're not familiar with the U.S. Energy Storage Association, I've been pleased to work in partnership with folks in MnSEIA and other folks in Minnesota. In terms of your question, Rao, for what can be learned from other markets for MISO and Minnesota within MISO, I think that there's a few different things that I could touch on. One of the key things certainly is making, and really one of the key themes here is the state market operator interaction, and making sure that that interaction is harmonized, in large part because one of the key takeaways, I think, from the discussions we've been having is storage is going to sit right at that intersection between state authority and wholesale markets and FERC authority. And getting those rules right for distributed energy resources, for example, like storage, is going to be most important for storage because of the way in which it's going to be playing between those two markets. Perhaps different than other resources may. So certainly from Order 841, we've seen a number of states moving forward to try and enable multiple use capability. And FERC's recent order 2x4, quad deuce, 2222, we can use whatever words you want. That's really going to sort of step it up a level for aggregations of distributed storage to participate in MISO's market, while also presumably being able to provide services locally in the distribution systems in Minnesota. So getting that all right is going to be, I think, a really critical part of the future value, particularly for the distributed segment in Minnesota and in MISO. And when I say distributed here, I'm not talking about only behind the meter, front of meter as well. Distribution connected are going to have a lot of the same questions here. So getting your Minnesota Commission to update its regulations to open the pathway, for example, for distributed storage, whether front of meter or behind the meter, in Minnesota to participate in MISO's markets is going to be a really important thing to do. And we're seeing places like Cal ISO and New York ISO that have actually started to be very proactive in putting in place those kinds of frameworks. New York ISO, I think, is a bit further ahead when it comes to creating a framework for aggregations of distributed storage resources. A couple of other things outside of that piece as well. One is making sure that there's an input process here with what's happening for your utilities and your entities responsible for resource adequacy. I know that there's obviously a discussion starting up at MnSEIA right now about revisiting the resource adequacy construct. And just, given that it's a universe where most states are undertaking integrated resource planning, making sure that those processes are linked up with MISO in terms of everything from projection of futures, right, which impacts transmission planning across the system to make sure that there is capability to hook up the storage that is being planned or hoped for, to making sure similarly that going the other direction, you don't have utilities saying in their integrated resource plans like, oh, this doesn't make sense, when, for example, you can look across MISO regions and see storage offers coming in that could actually provide resource adequacy quite cost effectively. So making sure that again, harmonization between the integrated resource planning process and MISO's planning processes is really important to make sure that storage is actually getting a fair shake. Beyond that, a lot of work on hybrid resources. We are, of course, in a conference from the Minnesota Solar Energy Industries Association. So making sure solar plus storage actually has a means to participate effectively in MISO's markets. Something that, to their credit, MISO have been taking very seriously when it comes to the interconnection side of this, but also the market participation side. There are some really open questions about how do you look at solar plus storage when it's participating in the markets? Is it a solar resource that happens to have some greater dispatchability, but is ultimately still submitting forecasts, having the same kinds of rules associated with it? Or is it acting more like a storage resource that has some sort of on-site fuel availability from the solar? This kind of a market participation framework and the way you account the capacity, that is the contribution to resource adequacy of both of those resources, is still an open question in MISO, and something that most RTOs and ISOs are still, again, working out their rules on. I think CalISO and ERCOT are furthest ahead when it comes to hybrids, and so that's a good place to start looking to make sure that you're getting appropriate capacity accreditation, allowing folks to participate with these resources without accidentally penalizing them for being hybrid resources is going to be really important. I could keep going on. I'm going to stop. I've been talking a lot for you all, but I think that should kick it off.
Thank you, Jason. I definitely appreciate it. I could fill an entire page with what you just said and cover a lot of business segments in MISO, given my knowledge about how MISO operates. But the key message is harmonizing the states and the ISO interaction, because that's where storage value really comes through. Janice, I would go to you next because I think your perspective and the name Sonnen, obviously you're in Minnesota, you're looking at Minnesota, is really gives a hot, warm, fuzzy feeling, if you will. So how do you pick a market like Minnesota, for example, to enter, and what are you essentially looking for?
That's a great question, and it comes down to a couple different factors. The first one, of course, is there is a large correlation between installation of solar and storage. So we do look for markets where there is high solar penetration, or at least a good ability for solar to take traction, which we have been seeing in Minnesota. Since storage qualifies for the investment tax credit, being able to pair solar with storage definitely takes a lot of total cost off of the installation. Another thing is we look for additional storage incentives, or just additional incentives. So for example, of course, in California, there's the SGIP. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's also in South Carolina, they have the additional state tax credit, which helps to reduce the total cost. And then policies, of course, such as net metering. If it's a state where there is no net metering, of course, the way that we talk about storage is a little bit different. And finally, I would also say, of course, areas with frequent power outages and or that have been battered by a lot of the different storms that we've been seeing lately. That's not necessarily as true with Minnesota, of course, but with a lot of the Gulf states and such, of course, just coming off of Hurricane Delta and all of these other ones that we've been experiencing, California with the fires, that definitely is an impact. Finally, we also really look at the contractor level, looking for good contractors to partner with, both at the contractor level and distribution is important. We've actually had a lot of success partnering with Andrew at Warner Electric and a lot of the contractors that he serves in getting storage and solar out into the market in Minnesota.
Thank you, Jenny. So definitely appreciate that. Since you brought contractors and Andrew into the discussion, Andrew, I'll ask you next. From Warner Electric perspective, you have a certain experience on how to bring storage to the market here in Minnesota. And I would think you have some stories to tell in terms of the hurdles for this storage boom to happen in Minnesota. So what are those hurdles in your experience, Andrew?
Thank you, Rao. So I think a lot of the hurdles, we could break them down into kind of in front of the meter and behind the meter. And I think Jason did a great job of addressing what's going to be necessary, what is necessary, and what's coming up in front of the meter hurdles. But for behind the meter hurdles, I would really kind of take it and break it into a couple of different problems. So one of the things that we see here in Minnesota is because energy is more cost effective here than in a lot of parts of the country, the utility rates have really focused on a very straightforward way of charging for power. And those are not necessarily up to date. So one of the things that I see as a hurdle to energy storage is actually how cost effective our rates are at the moment. And then the way that utilities charge for that is just masking a problem. It's not that energy storage couldn't and doesn't have a part to play in the Minnesota market and in the Midwest in general, but that the rates that we have on the books are just at a precipice where they're going to be changed in the near future, but changing them in a way that makes solar and storage and other renewables able to participate and participate smartly, I think is one of the hurdles that we're going to be facing and continue to face over the next few years. And then another one would be the way in which utilities manage manage their demand response programs. So the demand response programs that are in existence are mostly for, again, rather outdated procedures and equipment. And so updating those to include ways for storage, and then especially storage plus solar to participate. Those are a couple of the big hurdles that I see coming up in the next few years.
Oh, you mentioned demand response, Andrew. I think that's where I want to go next with Jing, with Fortress Power. Thanks for talking to us about your experiences, Jing. And my understanding is, based on where you are, you have some experience gained that you saw through energy storage, and it's growing in markets like New England. Partly due to demand response incentives offered by those utility companies there. I think a connected solution is something that you brought up, National Grid and Evergreen or EverSource has, I think. So how can utilities in Minnesota, what can they learn from that experience that is happening in New England, for example, on demand response programs?
Rob, thank you for having me. Nice meeting everyone here. So demand response, this is, I think a lot of you are probably familiar about this term, but how that works, I think this is something we really can learn from the New England. There's a few utilities that are offering that incentives currently to individuals like homeowners. Once Green Mountain Power in Vermont, they launched their bring your own devices solution, pretty successful, I would say. And the other very big utility company that is National Grid that are offering this Connect solution. They've been on the market now, starting the pilot project now over a year, and it's taking off very quickly. So what it is basically there's a third-party aggregate that is hired by National Grid, and they will integrate different devices. And we focus on energy storage, but they can also integrate, like thermostat and many other devices in the home to that aggregator's platform through API. So each device is, right, like energy storage, that each device has its own API. So through this API, that allows the National Grid basically can tap into your battery power. So in the sense that if they've foreseen there's going to be a peak demand, and instead for the utility to go third market to buy electricity, they'd rather to, utilize your battery storage power. And for each time they tap into your battery power, they will set up like duration, for example, like 3 hours for a certain kW. That's, for example, if you have a 5 kW inverter paired with a 15 kilowatt hour battery bank. So it will last for 3 hours, and they will pay you in summer $35 per kW. And the events that's going to occur is somewhere between 2 to 8 times a month. So you can simply use a very simple math, use $35 to multiply 5 kW to multiply the, occurrence, somewhere between 2 to 8. So let's pick a number, let's say 6. So you're really getting over $1,000 a month for your energy storage. And they have different rates for winter, but it makes energy storage now really more affordable for homeowners. And Andrew and also Janice mentioned about the cost incentives. So I think this is a good way for MISO or looking to that, offer some really good incentives for battery storage. And the more solar is going to be deployed, more renewable energy is going to be deployed. I have a statistic here. I think for MISO territory, currently it's only about 18% renewable, which is good. But from that 18%, it's really only less than 1%. It's about like 0.4% is solar. So there's still a long way for MISO to increase the solar deployment, but eventually that's going to increase. And then at a certain point, energy storage is really good way to stabilize the grid and benefit both the individual homeowners as well as the MISO.
Yeah, thank you, Jing. You brought up a good point about New England, bring your own devices or bring your own storage. And my perspective, given my experience in Minnesota and MISO states, is most of MISO states do not allow third-party aggregators. They have opted out of the demand response order from FERC, which could change in future, maybe with this latest order from FERC on distributed energy resource aggregation. Maybe there's a perspective that Jason wants to add here. Jason, I would love your perspective if you want to jump in about potential for third-party aggregation or utility aggregators, if you will, and the role they are playing in making sure storage is front and center.
Sure. Yeah, and thanks for mentioning the Northeast. Certainly the Bring Your Own Device programs initially started by Green Mountain Power, now that's spread to a number of different Northeastern utilities, are proving to be somewhat popular. Let me actually back up and say there's sort of 3 different ways I think you can do this. And the first is this kind of a administered utility program, where you are going to find yourself, for example, the utility will have a specific solicitation or need in a specific environment. They will offer some sort of payment in exchange usually for turning over dispatch control or some sort of agreed upon operations of the asset, which helps them, for example, with either a larger system capacity obligation being reduced, reducing the amount of transmission charges assessed to them, or some other localized need, for example, to defer a distribution system upgrade. Those programs have proven quite effective, in part because I think you find that the utility being in the center of that is fairly motivated to drive it as well. Then a sort of second approach that you have is sort of more of what I would call sort of your traditional programmatic approach, where there's a payment for things like peak demand reduction, but not necessarily a turning over of the dispatch control of the asset, and not necessarily administered by the utility, although oftentimes administered by the utility under regulatory oversight. So not necessarily a utility program in quite the exact same way. And so things like Massachusetts Connected Solutions, which is a peak demand reduction program, not a true VPP per se, but obviously can be used on a large range of installations in a similar manner, right? And then you have things like sort of value of DER type approaches, which New York has moved forward on. That's sort of a proxy for markets. Now with Order 2222, I think it's actually kind of an interesting question as to whether value of DER makes as much sense if you are in fact able to participate in the market for the market side of it. Nonetheless, for the distributed side of it, you would still want to have some sort of assigned value for a distributed storage resource to show up in a specific place and provide specific operations. And that, again, that kind of a value of DER approach is much more of a sort of regulatory approved tariff as opposed to a utility administered program, in the sense that the values are going to be defined through a regulatory process. So that kind of gives you the swoop of it. And I think for folks in Minnesota, it really depends on whether you're going to have a willing and committed partner in your distribution utilities. Some of your utilities, for example, I would say probably some of the co-ops may be very excited by this idea of being able to lower their capacity obligations through the use of hosting some of these distributed storage resources on their systems. Other distribution utilities, I think it just remains to be seen exactly whether they see this as something to take advantage of or something that's a threat to the business model.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Appreciate that. You brought up VPPs and also California a couple of times too, and others did as well. And so we are referring for lessons learned with other states and other ISOs for the right reasons in terms of applying those lessons learned. So maybe Janice, I'll ask you to jump in here based on you have some experience with virtual power plants, and you obviously have indicated you see Minnesota as a state, as a market, if you will, because of both solar and storage, complementary nature, if you will. So if we look at those opportunities for virtual power plants for both solar and storage in Minnesota, what exactly do you have gained, if you will, from an experience point of view with your project in Salt Lake City that we can apply here?
Absolutely, and thank you for that. We are actually working on a virtual power plant currently in Minnesota. I can't go into super details on it yet. Keep your eyes out for headlines on it. But long story short, what's so exciting about virtual power plants is, of course, we love behind the meter. It's really important for the overall deployment of storage in the market. But one virtual power plant, for example, the one that we have in Salt Lake City, Utah, it's called Solar Loft. That's 600 batteries in an apartment complex in Utah paired with solar. So you compare one project with 600 batteries versus 600 individual homes, and you can see that there's a big difference in scale and adoption there. What's really exciting about it too is it opens up the possibility of solar and storage to communities that might not necessarily have been able to afford or even look into these types of technologies. For example, this one that I'm referring to right now actually is working with low-income population and also a minority group all in one for this project, and is going to provide a lot of services to them in terms of reliability of energy and all of the wonderful things that we know that solar and storage can do. Finally, there's a lot of different ownership models for virtual power plants. We kind of call each one its own unique unicorn, and that's really what they are. And it's a matter of figuring out what all of the different elements are for any particular project, for any particular developer, for any particular population, and figuring out what, again, the needs are and how we can best fulfill those. So for example, what I mean by that is there's a handful of different ownership models available for it. The most popular, of course, is third-party owned, because you don't have to have any capital outlay for it. There's a third-party investor who owns that. Of course, they have the benefit of a solid financial return on investment. The community has the benefit of having solar and storage, so clean energy, reliable energy, resilience against any weather events or anything else that can happen for them. And then, of course, the larger state of Minnesota benefits because you're having additional renewable and quickly dispatchable resources available. Finally, for example, with this one out in Salt Lake City, Utah, we ended up partnering with Rocky Mountain Power to do some demand response services for them. And it's gone so well that we're looking at some other projects as well with it. So it really is, you know, nothing's that silver bullet, but this is really close to being one of those solutions that checks a lot of the different boxes that we need and really will help to accelerate the energy transition to clean, reliable, and affordable energy. Specifically, one more part on that, just what to look for it. Really, the policy and the incentives in place are there. It's just a matter of figuring out, again, all of the different elements of the project. If there's low income involved, it actually does have a lot of additional benefits. We like to partner with developers, get it started from the very beginning, integrated in the plans. There's just a lot of reasons why you want to do that, from even the physical design of the structure and making sure that we, you know, plan where these batteries are going to go. So for example, in Salt Lake City and in Soleil Lofts, we actually have battery units inside each apartment complex, which is kind of exciting. And what's really funny about that actually is it gets us buy-in from the individuals who have them in their homes. We have people who have named their batteries. It's just a part of their family. And as more millennials and younger parts of the population start to look for both, you know, apartment housing and then ultimately their own housing that they'll purchase, it is something that they do look for and care about in the larger scheme of things.
Janice, and I see Andrew is also showing up with the video. I just want to ask this latest question I see in the Q&A that is probably relevant to what you just mentioned, Janice, and Andrew, you might have a perspective here as well. The Excel's Solar Rewards PBI incentive, I don't know exactly the PBI acronym, but the Solar Rewards incentive makes it virtually impossible to connect a multi-inverter DC coupled storage system, given that the AC power must be combined and run through a production meter to validate the incentive. So, you know, do you see any potential solutions for larger multi-inverter like 10 kW plus systems to benefit from both this PBI incentive as well as the DC coupled storage? Can one of you answer that question? Maybe Andrew, it's your.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not intimately familiar with the PBI incentive, but I do know that that some of these regulations are very specific to individual utilities, and that Xcel is working towards making it more and more possible for energy storage to be added. So I've worked on multiple different projects with Xcel and energy storage over the last couple of years, and although their regulations are often they appear to be quite solid, they're actually a lot more flexible than what the documentation shows. So I would I guess just caution that although the requirements seem to be definitive, Xcel is actually quite flexible when it comes to the final installation. Some of their what look like mandates are actually more recommendations. That's what we've learned so far.
Janice, you're nodding your head, so I just want to make sure if you have a perspective, you can get in.
Sure. And again, I'm not super familiar with the legislation either, but what I would say on the DC coupled side of things is from a planning perspective on the batteries, I will say Sonen's AC coupled, but for these larger battery solutions, and a lot of times the DC coupling is a really good option, because this way you can make sure that it's fully integrated with the solar. You don't have the repetition of cost also of multiple inverters, and you also have more efficiency in terms of round trip. So that's all that I would add to that part.
Jing, what about you? Do you have something that you would like to add with regards to this DC coupling and AC coupling?
Sure. I mean, Andrew and Janice already covered, and Janice also mentioned about DC coupled advantage. But I want to go back to the question you asked, that how to aggregate, like, energy storage with a DC coupled solution together, bundle together, and into a bigger AC and connect to the utility. Now, I'm not very familiar with the Minnesota storage incentives. I did do some research. I know there's some incentives there, but from the technology perspective, I think microgrid is a very good solution for that. That you can aggregate, multiple different DC source in DC coupled solution or in AC coupled solution all together, and then bundle them together and integrate them with a utility. So this is actually a very interesting field, microgrid, and we've seen a lot deployment in South America because of vulnerable grid, but we also see now in some states here, for example, in Connecticut, there's also some microgrid pilot project going on. So it's going to be very good to bundle not just solar, but also, the wind and the other renewable sources together.
Okay, thank you for that. I have a question that I probably need Jason on, because we're going to move with this question from a microgrid to the macro grid on the transmission side. This question has to do with a severe overload of transmission in places like California, Hawaii, and New England. And that driver is essentially, or for the reliability sake, is not there in that quote unquote pain in Minnesota. So what could drive the programs forward in absence of that pain? That's a question, Jason, that the audience is asking.
I mean, I think that the quest to provide value is something that each developer has a strong sense of. And there are people talking to you right now saying they're deploying projects. I'm not going to tell you that you need pain if you can find and provide value to be picked up across the system. I think that some of that pain may also not be as visible as some folks would like. This is, for example, in the conversation around things like non-wires alternatives or distribution deferral, that information tends to be locked up and hard to access for developers. So do you know where the pain is more important than if there is some, because you may not, as a developer, be able to make a well-tailored offer to create the solution if that information doesn't exist. And I know that Minnesota has at least kicked off a distribution planning discussion, but I'm sure there are folks on this call who have a much stronger sense as to whether that's providing the necessary data and transparency that developers need in order to actually provide offers that make sense. One thing that we're seeing in places like California is you have like an avoided cost calculator for transmission and distribution deferral that is a publicly visible process, and that gives a developer some indication of value. You have distribution hosting capacity maps that are published and updated so that developers can see where on the system they should put their resources. And I think that that's don't necessarily think that there's not value out there to get. It just may not be visible in the way that folks would like to have. And I'm sure folks on this call have a much stronger sense of that.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for that plug for integrated distribution planning in Minnesota. We just started that, and obviously it's a good attempt, good starting point, and utilities have done a good job of answering the questions as per the requirements of the commission in integrated distribution plan process. But like anything else, it's a starting point. It doesn't give enough information out for the pain points in their network on the distribution system. Yes, there is hosting capacity. Yes, there is interconnection requirements for a distributed generation, so on and so forth. So that being said, we have bounce back and forth. We're talking about Minnesota and states like Minnesota in MISO, but we have bounced back and forth with experiences from California and other states. So maybe Janice, I will ask you this question because a popular sentiment I hear is we are not California, right? So we are Minnesota, we are not California or Colorado for that matter, because Excel has a footprint in both states. But one would think there is a lot to learn from successes that these states have experienced. So can you please speak to what was successful there and what can be learned? Because the market at large has changed since those states have essentially run off and done a lot of storage.
Absolutely, and I'll be the first one to say this is not California. While my experience started out there, I did move out of it, and I understand very well that there's a lot of things that we can point toward from the experience of California that were really positive and things to be learned from. But also equally, there's a lot of things to point to that were failures on California's side that we can utilize in Minnesota to leapfrog the process that we saw in California and replicate it in this market. There's a lot of different layers to this question. So, of course, on the policy side, there is the new time of use rate that's coming into place. That'll be big. But what I think is important is knowing how to position storage to customers. And I want to preface this answer by most of my experiences on the residential side, so behind the meter, and to homeowners. But knowing what will get them going, knowing what matters to them. Even in California, frankly, I would sit down when I was selling solar and storage and look at a customer in the eye and say, you're not buying this for ROI. Maybe, you have a wine fridge that you're trying to back up, and in that case, yes, you do have a little bit of ROI there. But let's unpack a little bit of the value of storage. Why are we talking about this? Why do you want this? And also integrating that conversation at the contractor level, at the home, or when talking to the homeowner, is important. So every single time I would talk to a customer about solar, I'd talk to them about batteries too, just have it be a natural attachment. And even that little part right there, having that conversation with the homeowner, really did see a high rate of attachment of storage to solar. And in the cases where it didn't, it actually gave me a lot of credibility with the homeowner to help them either talk themselves into or out of storage, because they don't want to sit there and be sold to. Nobody does, especially in Minnesota. What they want to know is, why does this matter to me and how is it valuable? So just one more example on that front, with all of us working from home now, having conversation about backing up your home, backing up your servers, backing up your ability to make your income is really important. Also on the policy level, there of course was the SGIP. Frankly, I think that's a really good opportunity for Minnesota to learn from. That was a beast of an option and didn't work very well. Quick anecdote that I always like to talk about on that one is the CEO of our solar company installed storage at the beginning when SGIP was coming out. It took him a year and a half to get his SGIP incentive. That's the CEO of a solar company who knows the ins and outs of working with PG&E. So I think that's a really good example of something that we can learn from California, how that didn't work, why that didn't work, and simplify the process if there is some sort of incentive that's put into place at the utility level, at the state level, or any level there. Another thing that we found really important, and that I'm really happy to be talking to the group here with them, with MnSEIA, is industry groups. So one of the reasons why we were able to have so much success is all of the contractors talked with each other. The CEOs, the salespeople, all of that. There was a really big network that was curated through organizations such as, we called it CALSA out there, the California Solar and Storage Association. All of us got together on a quarterly basis. All of us also got together on a monthly basis. And we talked about what's working, what's not working. Hey, what about this new storage product? How do you integrate this into your sales? And the reason that I bring this up is where a lot of success came in terms of growing the market was in having that resource for all of the contractors to talk to each other. We realized pretty quickly that, yeah, you know, on an individual deal basis, we're competitors, sure. But really, we're not all that much of competitors. The more important thing for us is getting the adoption of these different technologies. And we found it was kind of the, you know, rise in water raises all ships kind of situation. That by working together, collaborating, and really having this kind of think tank enabled all of us to have much larger sales and to ultimately grow the market in the Bay Area. Both from, you know, a company perspective and also a network perspective. Obviously, we all know people. And each individual CEO knowing each individual group of people just got this conversation going a little bit more in the homeowner level as well, which I found really important. Another exciting thing that's different is the market's completely changed. There's a lot of different products available now, a lot of better products. And there's a lot that's been learned on the product side. So Minnesota can really take advantage of that and kind of avoid a lot of the growing pains that we had seen out there in California. For example, now, of course, you know, there are the two main chemistries, but there's a lot of different price points that are available, a lot of different features that are available, and ultimately a lot of different solutions for whatever that customer need is that they're ultimately trying to fulfill. So we actually tended to have a couple different storage solutions offered at each contractor level that would fit those needs. So final example, when I was selling to homeowners, I had LG Chem, I had Tesla, and I had Sonnen. Those were kind of the three, you know, different storage options that were available. And having that and using those different products to kind of tailor the conversation, A, that built credibility, but B, ultimately led to getting the customers the product that they really needed. Now, happily for me, in my experience, it actually ended up being all Sonnens that we sold because of the safety and the reliability and because of the product. So obviously that translated into me working for Sonnen now. But the important thing is having different options available to you. I've talked a lot on this one, but the last thing that I want to mention on it, it kind of parlays into the last question or the last conversation that you were just having. Not at the transmission level, but actually at the distribution level, we ran into a lot of problems. And what that was is transformers on the grid were getting overloaded by solar. And that was ultimately costing homeowners tons of thousands of dollars because they were the last one on the line. Remember, their neighbors already had solar. And now all of a sudden this transformer had to be upgraded. Something Minnesota at large could do to avoid these issues and learn from those experiences in California is incentivize battery usage, because utilizing the batteries actually enables you to raise that threshold at which you have to start looking at, upgrading the grid itself.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that you threw out there, Janice. There is a question here that kind of hits on some of the aspects that you just raised as well. So if you want to answer it, if not, we'll move to Andrew and then Jing. But essentially, the question centers around winter, right? Winter cold climate here in Minnesota. And that entails using a lot of fossil fuels for heating purposes. And that's a cause of worry for regulators and consumers in general. So what is the best way to have a storage purchase that pays off its use? Because is there a future, if you will, in seasonal storage that can drive this seasonal fossil fuel usage down?
That's a question. Obviously, intermittency of the solar resource is an issue, especially in a place like Minnesota where you're dealing with a lot of snow, a lot of inclement weather. So having a larger capacity of your battery is definitely a good, just general option to start with. You have a bigger tank that you can pull from, so you don't have to put as many inputs into that tank on a day-to-day basis. But really to open that up, and I do have to apologize, I don't know the exact mix of the grid in Minnesota, but if there's specific times when resources such as wind or something are more online and there's a way to incentivize being able to fill your battery at those times, then you're still being able to fill your battery off of renewable resources is a good example. Looks like Andrew has some things to say, and I think
so.
Might as well. So I feel like I've been monopolizing the conversation.
Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. And Marty, thanks for that question. So that's a really important thing to consider. There isn't currently a technology that provides reasonable seasonal storage, right? So storing power in the summer and then bringing it into the winter. There really isn't much of a technology out there right now. Certainly nothing market ready. People are working on that. So there is a lot of research being put into seasonal. It's going to be more on the utility side, not so much the behind the meter side. But just like Janice mentioned, even though we don't currently have marketed technology, market ready technology that would do seasonal storage, wind energy in Minnesota could provide a good chunk of that, right? There are times in southern Minnesota and in Iowa where there's so much wind energy on the grid that it actually goes to zero or even negative pricing. So storing up the energy at those times, even in the winter, would allow energy storage to become an enabling technology to reduce fossil fuel use in our climate. And then another comment on that is the grid goes all the way from north to south, right? It goes from Texas up into Canada. So even though we in Minnesota aren't producing perhaps enough solar to be offsetting the fossil fuel for heating, there's a lot of production that's happening down south that it's moving up the transmission line, whether we intend it to or not. So that was my 2 cents, Ron.
I could add to that. On the note of seasonal storage and what's market ready, certainly there's a lot of folks in this space right now who are pushing various different options. And Minnesota is actually, I believe, expected to be host to one of the first deployments of a new electrochemistry that I believe the folks at Form Energy are moving forward on, presumably a sulfur-based chemistry that they are suggesting will have a sort of more than 100-hour duration at reasonable cost for their systems, which is, maybe that's, a week as opposed to weeks plural. But as I should note, this problem that folks are focused on is important in a high renewables future, but also one where there is a long runway between now and when the seasonal storage challenge is actually one that's particularly necessary to meet for a decarbonized energy system. So we expect to see a lot of the innovation work over the next few years on both different electrochemistries as well as a number of different options like liquid air storage, thermal storage technologies, folks who are working on power to gas, to all be getting ready for when this need does eventually arise.
Jason, I want to stay on you for a second. I know, Jing, it's been a while since I had a question for you, so I'm going to come to you next. But on this topic of transmission, we're essentially talking about MISO transmission and what's in the MISO functional control. There is a question here that you might have a perspective to add as well, because I know Energy Storage Association provided some comments to Minnesota PUC and Department of Commerce. What is the status of implementation of Minnesota's energy storage legislation, and could that be implemented on an accelerated basis?
So I think this is in reference to legislation that passed in the 2018 session, if I'm not mistaken. That legislation was sort of had a couple of things in it. One was a requirement for integrated resource planning reform, basically to ensure that energy storage is included and included appropriately. My quick read of the most recent Excel Northern States plan is that I'm not clear if they use cost information that reflects the kind of bids they're seeing in other parts of their system. It seems high, remarkably high, compared to what, say, Excel Colorado is publicly reporting folks are offering for storage. So that is probably going to be a continuing conversation, certainly with utility and the regulators, to make sure that not just storage actually being looked at, but is being looked at appropriately inside these integrated resource plans. So some more progress to be made there. On the next topic, which was sort of a storage cost benefit study, the Department of Commerce did undertake that study, I believe, with the folks at E3. And it was sort of a, I'm going to editorialize, a sort of underwhelming study. I'd say the best way to characterize it is a recranking of an IRP in many respects, and not necessarily sort of what was desired and hoped for in terms of the more granular and forward-looking valuation of storage across a variety of domains, which is fine. I'm glad for you all to show up with distributed storage resources that are going to be able to provide the multiple values that we think storage is going to be able to provide and may not have been captured effectively in some of those studies. As for the pilots, I have not been tracking the status of those, although I did note that the Form Energy sulfur battery is a pilot project per Great River Energy. Now, Great River is not jurisdictional to the Utility Commission, but I think that we're likely to see Otter Tail, Excel, MnPower undertake some things within the next few years under that authority. I do think, though, that the planning reforms, which were in some ways central to this discussion, have yet to be fully realized, and so more work to be done there.
Thanks, Jason. Jing, I promised I'll come to you next. So here's a question that maybe you can help answer from audience. How about coupling a natural gas or a propane generator or a solar as well to a battery? How would that work, or is that possible?
Yeah, sure. I mean, these days, if you look at energy storage, a lot of them are able to allow you to, connect generator to it. That would be considered to be your third backup source, because your primary is going to be the solar, right? And solar plus storage will be your primary. Depends on what application, but you can set up that way. And then you have the utility as your second source. And the third is if during an off-grid situation, if the solar storage is not enough to supply your power, then you can have the generator. And then you can set up, when the generator to kick on, when, for example, when the battery storage load then drop to 20%, and you want to have your generator to kick on to make sure that you're, to charge your battery at the same time, also power your home load. And that's on the individual homeowner level, but on the microgrid level, you can also integrate a very large diesel generator into it, and to balance out the whole microgrid power quality.
Power quality aspect, yes, that's important too. I see, I like energy storage, and I could talk about it for another hour, and I don't know if I get a chance again. But in the interest of audience and why we are doing this, to have a storage boom in Minnesota, I want to start hitting your key takeaways that you want to leave the audience with. Since I started with Jason first and Jing last, I will start with you first, Jing, and go to Janice and then Andrew and Jason. Jing, what do you want to leave this audience with based on your experience? Obviously, you're interested in Minnesota. I'm glad to see you here. And what can Minnesota audience do and others to basically get storage going?
Yeah, I think first important is, like the solar contract network, including manufacturers, including, Minnesota Solar Association, all should come together, really, work on the legislator side, work with the MISO, other utilities together. So that's very important. And second thing, I want to lift the audience, and especially for solar contract, who are really the one that, talk to the homeowner, to the business owners that pitch the storage. And I'm sure you guys doing a great job talking about solar, but really add a storage and talk about the stacking value of the storage, not just for the backup power, but also, to help stabilize the grid. And if there's time of use rates, it's going to be implemented, like in New England area, and for going future, there's a lot of stacking value that they really can get from the battery storage. So those might, takeaway for the audience.
Thanks, Jing. Janice, what about you?
Jing stole the words right out of my mouth. I think she is spot on. I think that one of the most important things is for everybody who is a stakeholder in this, so from the contractor level to the, Minnesota SEIA, to the distribution level, to even the manufacturer level, to all come together and work collectively. You can, really make a lot of changes and noise at the legislature level, but also just don't see each other as competition. See each other as really resources, and how can you all work together to ultimately fulfill the goal of getting a lot of solar and storage adoption, and frankly, making a lot of money along the way too with it, because it is a good lucrative opportunity. Utilize the resources that are available too. So for example, it's hard to start a storage program. It's hard to keep up with all of the different changes that are going on. So banding together within a group such as the Minnesota SEIA really is that format to do it. Final thought, this is kind of a little cheeky thing, but it's something that really worked out in California. We had this thing called the Solar Stomp Dish, and literally what it was is every single month we got together, we drank beer and we talked solar and storage. And it was just this great, informal, easy way to foster that contractor network, to get those different thoughts going. And then from those conversations, we ended up bringing a lot of the topics back to the higher level at, in this case, CalSA, but for this market, it would be the Minnesota SEIA, and see what can percolate up from that, because a lot of good things can. Also, lead with, or always include storage in pitches. It's important. It really is.
I think we might take you up on that offer, Janice and Jing, because I'm also on the events committee of this MnSEIA, so we are looking for always events to keep this going. So thank you for that. Andrew.
Thank you, Rao. I also will jump off of what Jing said. She mentioned time of use rates, and there were also a couple of questions about kind of regarding that. So again, utilities are kind of looking at an outdated model in how they do things, and the technology has advanced far beyond or far faster than utilities are keeping up to date. And so that really is where I see the most opportunity for enabling storage to be relevant, more relevant than it is already. And so as these rates and regulations and legislation are updated, keeping storage in mind and forefront is going to come up with a win-win solution, right? It's not that storage isn't there yet, right? The technology has the solution to a problem that utilities and ratepayers and RTOs and ISOs are all seeing. But we just need to make sure that everybody gets compensated in a fair way, not just the people looking to create an ROI, but even the utilities themselves, right? Let's solve all of the problems and have a win-win-win for everybody. And it is possible with storage.
Excellent, Andrew. Jason, you get to have the last word.
Well, I would just note that in addition to everything that folks here have said, there's an election, and you should make sure that folks know that getting a storage industry started in Minnesota is something that folks who want your vote should be thinking about. That's a really fast and extremely actionable way to get things moving. Of course, that also means making sure that your governor and your commission are doing the work that we've been sort of alluding to here, whether it's resource planning, distribution system information being given to developers, having harmonization with the larger market rules and the state's regulations. All of these things are going to be critical to unlocking the value that you all can provide in order to get a storage industry going. So, of course, the policy guy sees the policy route, but I think that there's a really great opportunity in Minnesota. So we'll be watching, certainly from over here in DC, as to what happens post-November.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, everyone. Definitely, I couldn't ask for more. Really happy how this ended up, and I'm sure there is more good news coming out of Minnesota that the DC and places like DC would start to notice. So thank you again for your time. Abby, I'll send it back to you if you have any closing things that you want to say on behalf of MnSEIA.
Thank you, Rao, and thank you to all of our panelists for this really great discussion, and thank you to all of our attendees. Our next keynote will be a diversity and inclusion training with Whitney Terrell of Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. She's designed a presentation specifically just for our audience of energy people. So I'm really excited. It's going to be great. That's starting at 11:45. So please join us for that. Yeah, and thank you again to our panelists and our sponsor for this session, Unirac.
Thank you, Unirac.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Nice to see you all.
everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.